Do you think, in your experience of having been around here, the discussions you've had and seen, migration has actually been resolved?
Well, my experience actually roots in deeper past, because I grew up in Estonia and I was born in '64 when we were majority in our country. When I graduated from school, 18 years old, we were minority. There were more Soviet migrants who forcefully came to my country. We are still dealing with the consequences of that kind of policies. I believe we've managed quite okay, but it's not resolved yet, 25 years later. Now, when we jump to the European migrationary pressures, so automatically what the planning institution like Commission suggests is, let's share the burden, let's show some solidarity. It's not that Italians and Greeks should be punished for their geography, we should help them. But it's also a difficult sell in many countries, starting from Hungary and Poland perhaps, but also in Germany and in many other countries.
A very, very high number.
Exactly. And then if we say, yeah, those people are fleeing from terrorist dictatorships, murderous conditions, and our task, according to international law, is to help them. And obviously it makes sense to have a coordinated response, which must probably include also calculations and plans what to do with Africa, given that the demography tells us it will be 1/3 of the world planet's population in 30 years. And if Homo sapiens doesn't have drinking water, it needs it in 48 hours.
Yeah.
He starts to move towards somewhere where water is.
But in terms of the politics of the European Union and the practicalities of the movement of people to spread and take communal responsibility of refugees and migrants who've arrived, in your opinion, has it been actually resolved? Is there now a consensus and a clear procedure in place?
No, not at all.
So was Mr. Juncker then being a bit disingenuous?
I disagree with him that it has been resolved. Yes, we have a deal with Turkey, which is not necessarily based on European values and human rights, but for programmatic reasons, we pay money, you keep them in. That's the deal. I hear that we are going to prepare the same kind of arrangement with Libya, which is one kind of, Juncker may say, that's resolved. But with those millions of people who are already inside, we haven't resolved anything really, because it takes time. It needs to settle them, to feed them. We created a lot of jobs, but not of all the migrants are employed. I don't think so. So nothing has been resolved really.
So nothing really. Well, let's just jump to...
I'm not saying that Commission hasn't been working with it, but we have seen the response from different member states. And it's not sort of one view for all. Everybody is having a different approach and slightly their own interests in mind, of course, whatever they say.
Indrek mentioned Poland-Hungary. Most obvious examples you'd think of there being no real consensus on the movement of people and how to spread the responsibility in terms of what the arrivals coming into predominantly Italy and Spain. Why did Mr. Juncker highlight that in his State of the Union speech as a real success story?
Well, he needs to highlight it because there's an election in Germany, and therefore he needs to help those political parties defeat the AfD. He also
so this was a case of him intervening.
I think it's absolutely clear that they're trying to interfere in the politics of Europe, because there's no way that anyone with any rational mind would say that the migration crisis has been resolved. No one has actually tried to stem the flow of people coming up from Africa by dealing with the issues of trade and unemployment and environmental issues of war and destruction that's going on there, that leads people to flee for terror, but also flee for economic reasons. No one's dealing with the terrorists completely. We're making billions on this. Equally, yes, you're paying money to Turkey, which, by the way, how well are they going to accept the way that Juncker insulted them so heavily today? In the same line, they might still take the money, but they might release, in their view, more people across the borders. And here, in this chamber, you've not got any of the real structures in place. The one thing that I found fascinating, and why I also believe it's political for the election, is the way that Marcus Weber, in his speech, echoed the terms of what Juncker was saying, is that we need to have a policy of closing the borders of Europe and removing those who are illegal migrants. Now, if you'd have gone even 3 months ago in this chamber, if I'd have raised that point, they'd have been calling me a racist, a xenophobe, rather than someone who wants to have managed migration. There's something else going on here, and I think it's trying to support the Germans in their elections.
Matt, what are your thoughts on Mr. Juncker's comment?
I think he was either being naive or disingenuous to suggest in any way that the migration crisis is resolved. It's far from it.
Who's the main barrier to it, do you think? What's the main barrier?
Well, it just struck me today listening that there was an inert contradiction in what Jean-Claude Juncker was talking about, to talk about the role of the EU in terms of addressing the migration crisis, which I actually agree the EU has not only a role but a responsibility to collectively address just the numbers of people who are coming in want of nothing more in the short term than a place to lie with their family and a roof over their head and some food and clean drinking water. And I wouldn't argue that in the most instances there's any aggressive element to their need for refuge.
Is it at the nation state level where there's the conflict? Fundamentally, member states.
Yeah, I think it's both. But the contradiction that I saw was to talk about the migration crisis, and particularly when we're talking about the refugees coming from Iraq and Syria, and not to equate that with aggressive military interventions by Western powers, is ludicrous in the first hand. But then to continue on in the speech and talk about the creation of an EU army, again, just exploits that contradiction, because the one thing that armies do is engage in military operations. That's their purpose. And when in Western powers engage with military operations outside of their own jurisdictions, well, then that's going to create displaced people, and that's going to exacerbate the migration crisis that we've seen.
Interesting, you just picked up on that point, because one thing that I picked up on is the comments he made regarding illegal migration and how to actually prevent people from arriving on the shores of southern Europe. And he said this isn't verbatim, but it was basically illegal migration will only stop when there is another option to individuals other than making the perilous journey over. Now, that indicated to me that there was some responsibility of the EU to not only resolve the issues of people arriving, but also to prevent them coming from their home.
And the way you do that, stop our corporations, stop our governments exploiting the countries in which these people come from. We were talking about Africa. The number of African countries by which corporations are actually draining them of their natural resources, refusing to pay the taxes that are owed. Nicholas Shaxson estimated for every euro that European countries actually give in aid to African countries, our companies are actually holding on to about €8 of withheld tax payments. So if we want to ensure that the issues are resolved at base, it's not that we need to interfere in their countries. We just need to make sure that our governments and our corporations stop exploiting those same countries.
So do you think, but the point I was making, perhaps Stephen, if you come in here, the point I detected on it is that there is an obligation or some kind of responsibility for the EU to be helping to resolve the issues in the home countries as well, which would indicate there is some place for European intervention in countries such as Libya, such as perhaps Syria, where there are large numbers of refugees coming to Europe.
No one will solve the migration crisis without going towards the source of where the problem is. And one of them, as Matt has quite rightly pointed out, is that about the exploitation of the natural resources and the people in Africa, for example. And one thing I found fascinating is when Jean-Claude Juncker was lauding the fact about, if you've heard, chocolate beans and the manufacture of chocolate in Europe, it is a known fact that in Africa, if they produce the chocolate beans, they can sell it to Europe, and they get something in the region of about 2.8 billion in selling them. But the moment they start to refine it into chocolate themselves, they get fined heavily by tariffs. But Germany, therefore, and the European Union, I should say, exports finished chocolate products back to the African nation states of over 3.8 billion. There's a billion excess. That is the type of problem that you need to deal with. Remove the tariffs that you impose on African countries to do something that is theirs, the chocolate bean, and let them be able to sell. You deal with that, you create jobs, prosperity in those countries, and you enable them to get businesses for their own people as well.
Indrek, final thoughts then. Do you think there is a place for the EU, not only to be dealing with the migration crisis at home on the continent, but
there
also...
There is one place for EU, it's Europe. Yeah.
And so you would not...
No, but I wanted to ask a bit about Africa. I mean, I understand your approach, and I basically agree that there is a lot of unfair things going on and done by our own businesses and governments. But the thing is, if we stop doing business in Africa, Juncker cannot report about economic growth, and no government can.
Nobody suggests do business fairly.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And that is quite a target to achieve. I agree. And that would resolve part of the migrationary pressures. But the demography shows us, and the deterioration of environment, that during 30 years, we cannot really have any impact. It's already out of the bottle, so to say. And African population grows, and the living conditions not necessarily. So they knock on our doors. And we must perhaps start from our own corner, sitting down and looking at the Geneva Conventions, which create the international law on these issues. And they were written in the desperate mood after the Second World War to be used in Europe. But now we apply them globally, and that's a different challenge.